Before you were talking about this really interesting kind of childhood upbringing and an interest in playing the piano, and eventually, obviously, went into architecture. But you were good enough and serious enough with the as a pianist to consider actually doing that as a profession and studying that.
Well, I think what's so interesting is when you, in a sense, have certain passions and they're in the world of the arts, whether it's, in the case of the visual arts or the musical arts or even performing arts, all of them seem to generate a certain kind of intensity. And, it was piano that got the intensity of the most focus, the most training, the most education. Uh, and yet, in the thick of all that, too, was an interest in architecture. Even our high school even had a couple of architecture classes, somewhat in the guise of drafting,
Hmm.
and then theater and performing. And so those were a kind of a constellation of the arts that were interesting. And um, I also grew up with a father who was an aeronautical engineer, mother who was focused on geography and geology. And so all of these kinds of peripheral sorts of awarenesses were going on. So, I think what became interesting is trying to weigh the idea of a kind of horizon of being a concert pianist or a horizon of being an architect. And there was some, I think, trepidation on my part about the fact that the field of concert piano is a pretty slender one with a huge consortium of people who were going to be pursuing that. And at the end of the day, you're still playing somebody else's music.
Hmm.
And the possibility of architecture seemed super interesting. I had also been doing distance running. I was the only female on the cross country team at our high school. Had to petition to get on.
You had to petition to
But
get on, really?
I did because I was running on the male team. There was no female team, so I was the only female on the team.
Wow.
And one of the things about training as in a sense, as a runner, is that you run in the morning, you run in the evening, and the hills in the Bay Area and Los Altos Hills are both steep and low, and the whole sense of really the sense of the landscape in that area is really extraordinary. And one of the places that we would do our training was at Foothill Junior College on their track. Um, and that was a beautiful, beautiful junior college that had been designed by Ernest Kump and Peter Walker. And so it was an incredible constellation of treasuring the topography, treasuring the oak trees, not tearing any one of them down, burying the phone lines, and creating a series of almost Japanese-style pavilions within this landscape so that it was really a school like no other. It really became a kind of a landmark project that was
Hmm.
copied freely. Uh, and the landscape was quite beautiful. And so ultimately, when I was trying to figure out where to go to school, I reached out to Foothill College to find out who designed it, and was lucky enough to find out it was Ernest Kump, lucky enough to be able to get an appointment to meet with him, and then get advice about where to go to school. And that ultimately led to going to UVA, where architecture and landscape were really both taught together, valued together, um, drew from Thomas Jefferson's invention of the kind of idea of an American campus with landscape and architecture being so joined. So it was, in a sense, it was one of those arcs that was, in retrospect, seems like it had more of an inevitability than it did. But I think it was as much chance as anything else that it kind of led to that sort of destination.
Right, right. I mean, so you're on the track team, the long distance team, rather, right? And you're running, you're seeing these landscapes, and you were moved enough to reach out and find out who the architect was.
That's right.
I mean, that's certainly initiative, and I don't think a lot of high school students would have that initiative. I mean, so you were just that curious about the place that you witnessed that often to phone call someone up and walk in, kind of, and say hi, I want to meet you.
Well, I mean, it was interesting. There was nobody who really could give me great guidance. The drafting teacher was also the basketball coach at our high school, and he
Of course.
um,
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
was
yeah.
not quite the one for guidance. My parents certainly couldn't give me guidance, and yet I knew whenever we were running there at Foothill, and it was not far from our house, it was beautiful. I mean, it was just at a completely different level, and it was clear that whoever had designed that knew what they were doing. And somehow I needed to figure out who knew what they were doing to be able to figure out how I could know what I was doing.
Right, right. You had previously mentioned also that as a child, you created a series of doll houses, and they, I guess, started off fairly fundamental, and they became complicated, pretty complex as well. But that the interest for you was maybe equal parts with the dolls and equal parts with the dollhouse itself, or maybe more leaning toward the dollhouse.
It's interesting. The dolls were a vehicle for these doll houses. I had seen a publication of Habitat and was just totally astounded by the idea that all these boxes could be piled together to create different indoor spaces, outdoor spaces, different silhouettes. And so I started building a series of boxes, actually using cardboard boxes from the grocery store, cutting them up with a steak knife, covering them with contact paper, designing furniture, turning in tomato baskets into a bunk bed. It was all the kind of ad hoc use of one thing, making it another. A film developing tray on a box turned upside down becomes a swimming pool, that kind of thing. So there were, a lot of them in production and piled up in my room and in the closet. They kept on kind of breeding. And what was interesting is you could make them a tower one day, you could make courtyards, you could make a courtyard with a tower, you could make them a bridge. And they were quite pliable and amazing. And each kind of new relationship set up a desire to make new kinds of furnishings and exterior stairs and decks. And so by the time I hit 8th grade graduation, my parents got me some real power tools so I could go beyond the steak knife to cut openings in the boxes, and then started moving to wood, and had an uncle who helped me figure out how to give them electricity and lighting. So
Wow.
These were real vehicles. They were kind of, I guess, in retrospect, proto vehicles for thinking about, form and architecture. And yet there was sort of no pressure, but there was an obsession, I think, to really turn one thing into another. And, in some ways I continued doing it. I even made a pretty elaborate one not so long ago for a niece that everything kind of stacked in and could be redeployed and do a variety of things.
That's pretty cool.
That's amazing.
Do you have any photographs of these doll houses?
I do. I actually have a few.
Oh,
yeah.
Cool. I mean, that's amazing. I was also wondering when you were talking about it, I wonder if that could be turned into a studio project of some kind, an assignment.
That would
make
be
a dollhouse.
Something.
I was wondering, did your parents knew at that time that you would eventually become an architect?
My parents were very much advocates for, I'm one of 4 girls, advocates for us to do anything we were passionate about. I think their conviction was, if you love something enough, you'll want to learn more about it. Your world will be expanded through the lens of the thing you love. And so there was a lot of advocacy for music, advocacy for drawing, and advocacy for painting, and pretty much anything we touched on that we would take on with commitment. There was, I'd say sort of the kind of the support and the encouragement. So, there's I think encouragement across the board for anything that drew out our intensity.
Yeah.
So you're at University of Virginia, and you got a Bachelor of Science in Architecture, but clearly the questions of landscape and more at that scale were present from a young age and throughout your undergrad, I assume, right?
That's right.
And so was there a gap period between your Bachelor of Science and then your Master's at Yale, or did you roll right into Yale?
No, there was a 2-year gap, and it was interesting. I moved to Washington, and I knew that I wasn't quite ready to go to graduate school. Among other things, I wanted to redo my portfolio. I was disappointed with what I produced in school, and decided I was going to redo every project I ever did in school and show kind of a before and after, because I felt like it took the last year of school to pull everything together, and none of the projects quite captured what I would have done had I known more. So I worked first for a firm that did airport connectors in regional areas, largely for freight, and then also restaurant conversions. It wasn't glamorous. But
hyper-specific airport connectors in regional areas.
Yeah, but I got very good at reflected ceiling plans and about stair connections. It was people were really generous, really mentoring. I was the first woman that was hired in this firm outside of the support staff, and everybody there was fantastic. And then and that was Giuliani Associates. Then I worked for Wynn Faulkner, who was taking work at a very small scale, kind of a modernist approach to residential projects. And so these were kind of very different pair of experiences. And I would say that kind of working environment really gave me a measure of how slow architecture was. You know, the sort of the high speed of a semester and then the slowness of design to construction. And there was just enough time in both of these projects to be able to see design and construction happen. And that was really, you get kind of addicted when you start seeing a very simple set of lines that you've created fully realized three-dimensionally. It's really amazing.
That all makes sense. You said that you went back and you revamped all of your projects from school. Did you actually end up doing that? I mean, I feel like a lot of students have ambitions, but you did it.
I did it. After work, I would work on the portfolio, and I would, think about what I would have designed, and I'd build models and do drawings, and eventually do every project. And they got a lot better. And I kept the old examples so that I could illustrate in the portfolio what had been sort of the conclusion for the semester versus what I had done later. And it really gave me a chance to actually think about them with a little more maturity than I could, say, in second year or third year of architecture school. Because I was pretty confident I wouldn't get into the schools I wanted to get into with my portfolio only capturing what I had been able to produce in school. So it was a kind of a calculated thing, but it was a lot of fun, actually.
I have to
critics, and I used anybody who would talk to me as a critic. Look at the projects.
I have to say that's pretty hardcore. I mean, we're going to get into talking about your office, which is very successful. But like, I think going back and redoing projects on your own is like really hardcore. As I said before, I know that like a lot of students talk about finishing things after school ends, but well, maybe you'll get this or not because you did it. But after you finish a project or a semester or whatever it might be, there's an energy kind of crescendo, and then it's just a dump, and then there's a void afterwards. And to go back and to actually pick up the pencil, pick up the X-Acto knife or whatever, and follow through. I'm curious though, did you find that when you went back, you were rethinking the ideas behind the project, or was more like the ideas were pretty sound, but let me re-execute in a way?
It was interesting. One was a visitor center, and I used the very same partie that I had, but felt like I was able to give it a level of grace that it didn't have the first time. But I think I'd nailed the solution, if you will, for strategy, but had not, in a sense, captured what it could be. And in another one, it was for a car dealership of all things. And I just thought my original idea stunk. I was thinking if I was really going to do it again, I would do it totally differently. And I did. So it was different for each one. Some of them I figured it out, and others I had not figured it out at all.
And your support group or your critics were just anyone that was around, your friends and family? I
had neighbors across the hallway. They were really nice. He was a lawyer. She was a civil rights activist. My parents were really nice. Nobody knew anything about architecture, but I'd just ask anybody I'd pin up two things and say, which one do you think is better? It just kind of created a forum for a conversation. It just was, because it was all happening at my apartment. After work, I could only pin up on my apartment walls, and that was sort of how it worked. But it was kind of a fun hobby.
Right.
There was no pressure, there was no deadline. I had time.
Right. The lack of pressure, which makes it difficult and to have motivation. Yeah. But if you can get over that, I can imagine it's very freeing. It
was actually, in retrospect, it was pretty good.
So I'm guessing also that process kind of helped you define some of your interests and crystallize them in a way, right?
Yeah, I think what was interesting was it's clear, from working on that, the idea of working with the abstraction of the design studio projects being brought to a higher level while I was detailing reflected ceiling plans that would identify where a sprinkler might go. These were two very different mindsets. So I think arriving at Yale, there was a desire to, among other things, figure out what it was like to be designing things at a higher level with an aspiration at some point to be able to build.
Was there ever a case when you thought that maybe you would not go back to school and not get a master's, or was was a master's always pretty clear in the horizon?
It was always clear. I actually thought I was only going to take a year off, and my portfolio work didn't begin until a little too late, so I ended up taking 2 years. So I had originally only intended one and then took 2.
And you never thought about going into grad school for landscape architecture or even urban design?
No, and I was even pretty unfamiliar with those as, potential destinations in my own mind. I was still very much an architect interested in the landscape and broader urban and infrastructural ideas, but coming at it as an architect, and so, interestingly enough, the landscape graduate students were side by side with the undergrad architecture students at UVA, and the studio space was actually quite a beautiful way for peripheral vision to influence what you saw, what you heard, and what you were part of. And it is true that the more sophisticated conversations were right next door in the landscape studios, because they were graduate students. They had massive models with trees in them and, really, very sophisticated conversations. And so that really was a kind of a drumbeat acoustically, right, in our undergraduate education. So I do think that part of it was just the good luck of that proximity.
Yeah, landscape architecture is something I've become more fascinated in the last number of years. And but I don't know if you would know this, but at that time when you were at Yale, was landscape architecture as defined as it is today? I feel like it's kind of a loose profession.
Absolutely. I think that in the recent decade, really, landscape architecture has become far more legible and impactful in terms of the way the built environment is addressed. And so it has grown and emerged, quite a bit in the past decade. And I think at the time when I was in school, it wasn't nearly as legible a field.
Right. It's funny how these things kind of work. So at what point did you start Weiss MANFREDI? Or I guess the first question is, when did you first meet Michael? And then we're going to ask him the same question and see if the answers line up. We met at Mr. Jurgela's office. Aldo Jurgela as an architect, had really, I think, captured many of the things that I was passionate about. I had wanted to work for Louis Kahn. Louis Kahn was no longer alive, and there were very few architects who seemed to carry that spirit forward in a compelling way, and Aldo Jurgela's work very much did. And so I applied for a full year. Every month I applied to get a job there, and every month they would take my resume and put it away. And finally, there was a moment, I think, where they actually just had enough work that they needed to hire quite a few people. And so when I joined, Michael had been there for 5 or 6 years. And there was a kind of an interesting moment where, just as I was arriving and, kind of figuring it all out, he was leaving. But I had heard that he was a good designer, and we sort of struck up a conversation at a certain point. And so even after he had left the firm, there was, a kind of common thread that we had around feeling like it was really insufficient for architecture to be only for those who could afford it. And the Architectural League was doing a series of projects, one of them called Vacant Lots, which was looking at affordable housing as a kind of ideas competition. And so we decided at that time to just do a project together. And I was working on the Volvo Museum, so I was traveling between Sweden and New York. I'd spend 3 weeks in Sweden, 2 weeks in New York, and vice versa. So I did my board in Sweden. Michael did his board in New York. But we're both left-handed, and we both discovered we could draw in very similar ways. We kind of matched up our drawing styles for the actual submission. Wow.
And even to this day, people don't know who did which board. And that was kind of our first, I think it was 1987, through the Architectural League. That was our first kind of engagement. Then we did New Schools for New York, again, also through the Architectural League, also Bridging the Gaps. We did a number of these kind of competitions together. and just found that we had a kind of a shorthand where we sort of had a hunch about what was going to work, what was strong, how to make it, be communicated through drawings. And so we entered 2 competitions, but the one that we entered first was the Women's Memorial at Arlington National Cemetery.
Yeah.
And Michael's mother had served in the military. She had been dismissed when she was pregnant with Michael. She thought we should try to, participate in this competition. We did. We were fortunate. We prevailed. And then not long after that, we entered the New American Green competition, which was a 20-acre park just south of Chicago. And again, entered that one, and we were lucky enough to win that as well.
Wow.
So both of those projects effectively launched our office, and both of them seemed to be equally concerned with architecture and landscape together, and also committed to a public dimension, which was, for us, one of the most important things. We weren't terribly interested in doing private homes or very exclusive projects that couldn't be able to touch or engage a larger community. So that's how it all began.
So how many competitions did you guys do, I guess, leading up to the Women's Memorial? It was like 3 or 4? I mean, you did a bunch.
We did a bunch. They weren't so much competitions. They were ideas competitions, so to speak, where they were for exhibition. I think the first one that we did, the Women's Memorial, and the second one that we did, the New American Green in Olympia Fields, those were the first real competitions we had done, and we were lucky enough to win both of them. So that was really how we sort of effectively established a firm and got some space and hired some of our students. And
right.
But so you guys were doing those ID competition while you were having a full-time job?
Well, at that point, I had started teaching, and Michael, after we were made the round 1 of the Women's Memorial, which is 2-phase competition, he left the firm he was working for and started teaching. So we were both teaching at the time when we were doing these competitions, ultimately.
And where were you teaching?
I was teaching first at University of Maryland, and then later on at University of Pennsylvania. So I was actually we were working in the Olympia Fields competition when I was at Penn.
The comment about the 2 boards being not legible enough, or you can't understand who did it, which is really interesting because it never occurred to me, because obviously a lot of the work now is digital, and authorship is much more easily shared when it's digital. I hand this off to you, we copy line weights or whatever it is. There's a lot of like editing, but when you work by hand, and especially if you're not in the same country, right, you have to. So I guess you guys did like, because you didn't even have Skype, right? So like Zoom, right? So you must have done some tests before and decided like this is roughly the way. We sort of
did little scratch pads. We here's going to be our weight for lines. This is going to be how we're going to do tone and shadow. This was very much in this kind of charcoal pencil moment. And being left-handed meant that the kind of backslash and the whole grain was going to be exactly the opposite of a right-handed person. So we could actually produce the very same effect by hand. So it was a kind of a studied thing, and we both could actually achieve something that could be shared across both. But no, we didn't share our boards at all. I mean, I shipped mine from Sweden, and he sort of assembled them. The only way you can tell who did what is that they're yellowing differently because they are in different kinds of paper.
It's amazing. That is amazing. So at what point in this process did you realize that, we have something here, I don't mean romantically, but professionally, we can talk about romantically, but professionally that, there's some kind of synergy and there's a lot of potential. Was it the winning of the competition, or was it before that you guys felt, regardless of whether I win this competition, we're going to try and do something?
I don't think we never thought about it specifically. I mean, it was the winning of the competition that we were forced to, because we were asked whether we had a firm and whether we had the capacity to do the project ourselves, or did it need to be handed over to somebody else? And we thought, not on our watch, So we literally made up a firm and had a colleague of ours who was a graphic designer make business cards so that we could go to a press conference as a firm. So that was kind of done overnight, coin flip about whose name went first. And
really? Was it a coin flip? Was it a coin flip?
A coin toss, yeah. I mean, the interesting thing is that our graphic designer friend, David Curry, said, I'll make you these cards. And he laid 5 out in front of us. And I thought, okay, that's good. He made 5. That's probably enough. And in our first conversation, and I said, thanks, and started getting ready to stack them up. And he said, no, they're all different. You have to choose which one it is. And they looked very similar. And he finally described that the only difference on any of the cards was the spacing between the names, the slash, and the second name. And he apparently, if they're really close, it meant like it was a fused identity. When they're really far apart, they're independent identities. And when they're sort of somewhere in the middle, they were somewhere in the middle. It was a very stressful moment having a graphic designer with his eye describe design and meaning in design,
right,
in a way that had to be sort of decided within about like a half hour.
So which one did you choose?
Somewhere in the middle.
It's funny, the graphic design thing about the spacing between the letters. This is something that I do all the time with Marina. I mean,
it drives me crazy. I'm like, I can't see the difference. It's like, no, there is a difference. I'm like, yeah, it doesn't matter.
Right. Yeah.
No, but it does matter.
No, I
know. So the competition you won is was widely publicized and people know about it. But I do want to point out there's a lot of interesting things with it. It's a great design. But I also like the part of that story that the competition brief said, these are the rules, and you guys completely went through the rules, right? I mean, yes. You broke the rules. You went through the wall. You weren't supposed to touch the wall. And right. I think that's a great lesson.
Yeah. I mean, it was very interesting. It was a 1927 historic McKim, Mead and White retaining wall. And it literally was this huge, like 180-foot diameter arc that held up about 22 feet of soil, and then behind all of that was the cemetery. And the intent was that there would be an education center or building on the site, and then there would be a commemorative element that would be associated somewhere around this hemicycle. And our feeling was, first and foremost, that it would be a terrible idea to have a freestanding building on this very important site. It didn't make any sense. As much as we felt we could do a good building, it didn't seem right. And then the next thing was that wall had just been a retaining wall. And in fact, the original McKim, Mead and White working drawings had pictures of sculptures in the niches and inscriptions, of which the existing wall had none of those. And it said inscriptions, it said inscriptions in sculpture not in contract. And our feeling was, here it was, this whole idea of this decorative retaining wall that had no meaning, but it was a huge, thick wall. And the experience that the women in the military had experienced was that their voices were not heard. They weren't recognized. They didn't even get benefits until the 70s. So the idea of being able to have the symbolism of breaking through walls could be literally embodied on the site and could actually convey their voices in terms of the commemorative symbolism seemed very resonant. So our feeling was, well, we're not going to win this necessarily, but let's do what we think is right, because it just seems so wrong to do it any other way.
Did McKim, Mead and White ever reach out?
They were all dead by that time.
Oh, right. I sometimes forget. I guess they're
sometimes that helps.
Firm.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm sure they would have liked it anyway. It's a pretty cool project. So I guess so the firm kind of started in that way, and it seemed like maybe did it grow fairly organically from there on to now, because you guys are very successful in New York City. I mean, in the world, obviously, but you do good work. They're large projects. You're consistently putting out good work. It's an accomplishment.
Thank you. I mean, we grew very organically. I know after we won the competition, we thought, wow, this is fantastic. The phone will ring off the hook. And of course, it was dead silence. And we were certainly counting on our teaching incomes and, the few folks who we were able to bring on to work on the project. And it took about 2 years for that project to get going. It was very elongated time frame to get approvals. And so what we had thought would begin right away did not. We sublet space from our friend, the graphic designer. We had 2 desks in the office. Sometimes we had a part-time student come in 2.5 days a week. Our first Christmas party, I brought my sister so there could be 4 of us. It was really a tiny affair.
Yeah.
bit by bit, we hired additional students. And then when we won the Olympia Fields competition, that's when we hired our first, truly experienced architects. We hired what we called a grown-up, another former student, but who had been working for a while and, knew how to put together a drawing set. And so it really was pretty organic. It was kind of one person at a time. And we went from subletting space in a few different places to finally getting our own space on 29th Street. That was our first, fully independent office.
And you guys were in New York City this entire time. Was there ever an inkling that you would, move and go somewhere else? Somewhere else?
It's interesting. I think Michael, often wondered whether he would go back to Italy. He grew up in Rome. I think there was a lot of very good architecture coming out of Italy at the time. It was Milan in particular was a very exciting place. And I had wondered, I had actually planned to go back to San Francisco, go back to the Bay Area. I had wondered whether I would return home to California and, back to the Bay Area. But those were soft inklings. And because everything occurred so organically, we weren't really forecasting very far in the future. It was really effectively one project after another. And, in conjunction with teaching, that was really providing the fabric of our commitment.
I was wondering, and maybe this gets to more recent years for your office, but so with single family work, it's pretty obvious how you get a client. It's through networking, or you meet the client and it's an individual, it's one person, they want to do a house, you're an architect, and they're like, oh, I like you, then we go forward. But how do you get projects that are, cultural institutions, academic buildings, and the things that you guys do? Is it mostly competitions? How does that work?
RFPs?
Well, I would say
right.
maybe a third of the larger projects that we have gotten have been from competitions. So that's really, call it the cold call. Those have been, we've had the good fortune of winning a few of them, and those have led to commissions that have given us some credibility or legibility then for invitations, to compete for other projects, not through competition, but through interview. But it was the competition work that really led to a kind of framework of projects that were cultural projects, institutional projects. Those were the ones that interested us a lot because they asked broader questions. They had very high aspirations.
Right.
They're the ones that got us excited. And we were fortunate enough to be able to capture a few of them to get some momentum for the work that we do.
So are you guys still doing a lot of competitions today, or is it, I'm also wondering because the issue of doing competitions as a professional office is sometimes difficult because it's a lot of resources you have to spend up front. And there's even kind of a debate as to whether or not it's healthy for the profession and things like this.
I think it's a very active and good question. There are certainly a number of competitions that we have done because we actually want to explore a set of ideas that we don't necessarily have in the office at that time. So you could say it's a selfish desire to learn something, to try some things out that we've never tried before, because it is a big investment of time and resources. And yet, most recently, say the La Brea Tar Pits competition, it was a competition that interests us so much. As kids, my mom, with her passion for geology, would get us, in the back of the station wagon. We'd go down to La Brea Tar Pits from the Bay Area. It smelled. We wondered about it. These were kind of these super interesting kind of romantic feelings that had a kind of underpinning of science that gave them intensity and a kind of public dimension because of the park. And a museum that was the first one that ever did the kind of visible fishbowl lab. I mean, so, how can you not enter that, right? It's such an amazing question that you want to be a part of it. And so I guess we choose competitions based on ones that capture our imagination in the first place, because they're, in a sense, they're exercises to be able to push things even further than you might necessarily in a commission that becomes so mediated by the process and the typical meter that projects often have so much consensus building along the way that the speed of a competition is actually quite nourishing.
Right. That's interesting. Yeah. That's a big difference actually. The timeline, but also on a competition, you're kind of left to your own to interpret and create and without having to have constant feedback of do this, do that, don't do this, don't do that.
Right.
So I'm also wondering if within your office you guys feel like you have a discernible style in the more superficial sense, or a discernible process to with the way you design. And if you do, what is it? What is the process?
It's a super interesting question. I would say the question of style and process are, I think, totally different questions.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, you could say Richard Meyer has a style. It's maybe
Sure.
unlikely that we're going to have, a wood-lined building, or, it's unlikely that we're going to see things that go beyond the color of white, for instance. Process is, again, something different. And for us, it begins with, I would say, a broadcast tool chest, if you will, from research, model building, reading, drawing. In a sense, it's a pretty panoramic set of things that we're doing simultaneously, and we're also postponing conclusions as long as possible, so that it can kind of bear the fruits of all this kind of, stray electrons of information, of research, of intuitive work. But model building is probably one of the most important parts of what we do at the very beginning, just because you feel things in a very different way when you're building models than when you're simply drawing and representing things. And so is there any technique or thing that we do? I couldn't say that, other than somehow it's all of it all at once that allows you to kind of pull away all the extra bits and figure out what endures with every exploration as being essential.
Is it scary to approach every project that way, though? As opposed to having a more, systematic kind of and very clear step-by-step process you go through. A safer route.
I would say I would admire anybody who has a confident teleological way to get to the right place.
Admire or be very questionable of them. Yeah. Well, the process and style, I agree that they are different things. And I don't know why. I suppose I use the word style because more recent, the question has come up to us. And I guess in a way, I'm thinking maybe more from the client's perspective. Like, we get a lot of people who are non-architects that assume, like, one of the first questions you get is, what style of architecture do you do? And I don't know how you guys would categorize your work, but so, would you guys ever embark on doing like a classical or, traditional style project? Or is it like, no, we do, modern?
I would say we're pretty much modernist architects who are, in a sense, energized by things that have a kind of an essential quality that has a level of surprise, and often operates in the realm of shaping the site first and delaying architecture for quite some time. Sometimes the architecture ends up almost disappearing, as it does at the Brooklyn Botanic Garden or even the Olympic Sculpture Park in Seattle. It would be, I think it would be overstating the case to say that we would never do a traditional building. I would say that some of the vernaculars that have been traditional from, say, the 6th century, 7th century would be pretty intriguing to recast and reinterpret. But if we talked about classical architecture, as in some of the recasting of classical architecture that grew out of, say, postmodernism, probably that would be less likely. Right,
sure. I mean, I can understand that, I suppose. And then looking at the work that you guys do, what's interesting about your office, I feel, is that the types of projects you undertake, the types of competitions you get involved with, and the designs themselves all seem to be a very sincere extension of what you and Michael are interested in, right? And is that the case? I mean, that seems to be it.
Yeah, I don't think we would be particularly energized to do work that we weren't deeply connected with in some fashion. And in that regard, sometimes opportunities have come through the office for us to consider that just don't feel like they resonate with the values that we know we value. And so we've elected to say it might not be the perfect fit. And and others truly do, even if we don't have all the experience in the world to do it. And that's where we really kind of love the stretch of finding ourselves in territories we've never been in before.
Yeah.
Because I think you have very fresh thinking when you take on something you've never done before, but you know you're passionate about finding a way towards it.
You know, another question I had about the work itself is that there's clearly an interest and attempt to create structures that are responsive to the site, right? And I guess I wrote this question down. I don't know how it's going to translate, but how do you create something in architecture that is, on the one hand, responsive to what's going on around it, but also has its own very strong and distinct presence? And because that's how I would describe a lot of your buildings. It's that they are, when I look at them, they're for sure responding to site. They're not random, absolutely not. But they're also not just a victim to the site. There's something else happening with them that makes them stand out and be, almost icons. They're icons, but they relate to the site, which is a lot of times not the case.
Right. Thanks for saying that. I mean, I think that's our aspiration, is that the idea of form has to have agency at multiple levels. And I think we actually believe that architecture should have some legibility. And the agency of form is a powerful one because it in many ways identifies the significance of a building, the invitation of it, its silhouette, its arrival on a site. And yet, I think what we're very interested in is that kind of lateral terrain, that open-ended question about where the project stops and starts. And we tend to find ourselves actually moving beyond the project boundaries sometimes to make sense of a site and to make sense of a building on that site. And so we actually find ourselves often giving as much measure and architecture, if you will, to the site as we do to the building itself, which is why its legibility in some ways almost emerges like a series of waves welling up into something that finally has some super legibility at the moment where the program, if you will, is really central to the brief. But, there is that, I think for us, also an idea of something being essential in the expression of what the project can be, and where that essential element is or identity is probably different for each project.
Right. But within the office and the process, it's something that you probably feel pretty instinctually at this point when something is not essential and it's in the project or it's driving it the wrong direction. Yeah.
I mean, there's a funny expression that Ralph Lerner, who was a critic of mine when I was an undergrad, and I'm sure it's been said 1,000 different ways, but his observation was, when in doubt, leave it out. And he never said it very nicely either. With great impatience about things that seemed like they were flourishes, that were fashionable or extra, things that were sort of dragging weight, almost like ballast on the true idea. And I think that he was pretty instrumental in our sort of figuring out that you need to get rid of the ballast if it's not contributing.
Interesting. Is there an interest to do high rises within the office? Or because, you're in New York City, you're in Manhattan,
right.
These new skinny, what do they call them? What are they called?
Super tall.
Super talls, right.
Super tall, super skinny.
Vanoli has one. It's had a lot of problems. Shop has done one. Do you want to do one of those?
I think that if there was a reason to do a tower because it was, in fact, trying to do something that had never been done before and could have a grace in its participation in an urban setting, it would be interesting. But it would certainly be far more interesting if it came with a higher set of aspirations than simply trying to maximize the market value of being able to sell or lease space through the kind of styling of something that was, potentially, compelling and good looking. I think it would be interesting in part because, in a way, towers are something we haven't done. They are interesting in that if you're trying to create density so that you can create a more sustainable city, so that it's more of a walking city, a more living, working city, that becomes interesting. But again, though, for us, it would be pretty important for it to have some values that we could really get our arms around and believe in.
Yeah. I don't know if at least if we're talking about super talls, I don't know if that that brief is going to come around soon. It tends to be, I mean, obviously, as you know, that those are for the most wealthy people, the wealthiest people, and there's not a lot of contribution, I don't think.
Right. But the buildings that you guys design are pretty large in scale. I mean, they're not very tall, but they're, pretty big buildings, right? I was wondering, like, what is the hardest part of working on those types of buildings?
Sorry, could you say that again? I didn't hear.
What is the hardest part of working on those types of buildings?
On tall buildings?
On the types of buildings that you guys work on, like the not super tall, but like like campuses, institutional, educational buildings.
They're big buildings. Yeah,
they're big buildings. I think that the probably the hardest thing is that the bigger they are, usually the larger their constituency, and the larger the constituency, in a sense, the more voices are that need to be balanced. And what we've discovered is that it really helps to have a champion who has a vision for what the project might be without being able to say, I want something right here, the door needs to be there, the AV must be here. And the tendency in many of these larger projects is if there are many people having some agency and ownership for them, each one comes with them an expectation of what they have already as being essential, as opposed to necessarily being able to think in conjunction with their colleagues about what they might have together that might eliminate some redundancies and create space for something even better. So part of, I would say, our job that is complex is trying to tease out what are the most important things, because inevitably there are budget boundaries, there's site boundaries, there are a number of things that make you want to be strategic about what you choose to build with your client. And so perhaps our largest challenge is working very closely with them so that there still remains an idea about something where the sum of the parts are not just the sum of the parts, but there's something that can be brought through design that transcends that indexical reading of a program to create something that maybe they never even thought about.
I like that, the indexical reading of a program. That's fantastic. So when you were talking about it's important to have someone that has a vision, you're talking about the client side. They need to have someone that's the one person hopefully that's in charge, and they have a vision, but it's not specific enough to where they're just trying to satisfy their own very specific requests for whatever reason they might have those.
Right. I mean, usually the best visionaries in a project know that they too are choreographing many, many agendas all at once, and that they have a higher goal in mind, but they do want every agenda to be taken seriously but elevated. Those are the most exciting clients to have. And they also don't have an answer in their mind and hope that you're just going to actualize that answer. They're counting on you to bring a level of thinking and design thinking to the table, because they know that's what it's going to take for the project to have an identity in life that it might not have otherwise. And those are, the best kind of clients to have.
So when you do have a client who they're more trying to design or be the client by committee, too many chefs in the kitchen, I suppose. Well,
and usually in some ways, depending on the client team, it's very helpful for them to see what choices look like. Sometimes there's a description of what they believe is going to be the right solution, and it becomes important to document that so they can compare it to something else that might actually be able to capture a higher set of values and have greater benefit, even though it might not answer fully every one of the questions that were brought to the table in the sort of comparison. So sometimes we find that it's very helpful to show more than one solution and only show ones that we could believe in. We're not going to say this one's bad, this one's good. We'll usually try to share a couple of ideas that we think have value. But inevitably what you find is you should never underestimate your client. I mean, they're smart and they can tell when something is offering something that you might not have thought about. And I think that's probably the biggest lesson that we've had is sometimes it may be trying to communicate with 1,000 different voices, but usually if you're sharing options and considerations, they're going to make the right decisions.
Right.
You were saying that you guys, when you start working on projects, you do a lot of reading, sketching, even physical models. Do you still use physical models for client meetings? Like in the digital world that we are right now, where it's all about renderings and digital media, does the presence of a good physical model showing the site and the building and the form, still works?
I mean, we work with all of it. Honestly, we're so grateful for super three-dimensional modeling capacities. We're, excited about animations because they tell us how we're going to see something from different approaches. So we're using all of it, but the physical model becomes, in many ways, a kind of companion, because there are moments where, as you start accommodating, all the kind of systems that need to go in there, and then structure starts getting chubbier, the HVAC systems start taking up more section, things get pretty ugly. And so it's pretty useful every now and again to go back even to a physical model. And we did this on the Women's Memorial when we finally accommodated all the mechanical systems in the ceiling. We took one look at the physical model, even though the details made sense. When we finally joined those details all together to that overall form, we thought, oh my God, it's horrible. And immediately took all the HVAC out of the ceiling and put it in a plenum wall. And so that was a pretty important moment. And we were late in the game. This was right in the middle of design development, where everything had been established. Our engineers had calibrated everything for the optimal air distribution. And we basically took that physical model and rebuilt it and realized that we had really lost track of what was happening. So it was kind of working in both.
And you guys have a physical model shop in your office, I believe we saw last time.
That's right. You saw it. It's pretty petite. It tends to kind of get distributed across the desks and in the back area, but it's basic.
Going quickly back to the question of working with clients, do you find that when you're having to kind of reframe a client's thinking sort of and say, like, here's a better way we could do things, that there's a more priority on, like, they're more concerned that the return is a financial one as opposed to, I don't know, a social one or something else? Do you have to find different ways to convince people of a route and sell them on it on one particular way, the financial one, let's say, even though there's benefits in others, or are people receptive to these more elusive,
Most
qualities?
people are receptive to very good ideas, but they're also, in a sense, stewards or caretakers of money that's often not their own.
Mm-hmm.
So there's sometimes very fixed budgets, say for an institution. And so what becomes very important is to be incredibly strategic about where something has to happen, and then where things can be achieved economically, where they can be done in many different ways. And so a lot of our work is not just, quote, convincing, but also illustrating the value and also illustrating some areas where we may not invest as much to be able to allow something to happen. In the case of the architecture school at Kent, we reduced the scale of the building by 1 floor to be able to achieve the kind of pedagogical goals of spatial transparency and still work within the budget.
Is there a project type that you guys have not done yet that you want to? Aside from a super tall.
Well, there's so many. I think it'd be fantastic to do more international work. We're loving the project that we're doing for the U.S. Embassy in New Delhi, India right now. We're also working on a project in Kathmandu. And that starts to think about projects that are almost complexes, complexes or constellations of many buildings that, connect with urban areas, with landscapes. And the more we think about it, we really do need to be very mindful about how we work with our environment now. So to have more projects that allow us to kind of stretch the infrastructural questions that are at stake, the social questions that are at stake, and the environmental questions that are at stake, they could take form in many, many different kinds of projects. And I think we are really excited about the kind of horizon that actually pushes the boundaries of the traditional notion of a building, and a building that is a buildings plus, in terms of effectively cultural campuses become very interesting.
Yeah.
Projects in the arts become very interesting, particularly when they are trying to be infrastructural in terms of how they catalyze growth and identity of a community. So one would argue that it's not so much a typology, although arguably libraries, for instance, are things that we're forever fascinated by: theaters, performing arts, museums, all these cultural projects, when they have a plus dimension of engagement with communities that might not have had an opportunity to engage with them before, those become super interesting.
Oh, I'm excited just listening to you talk. So then talking about, internally at your office, so, how many employees do you have? So we have a rough sense. And then do you have different professionals like landscape architects and architects or interior designers? I don't know, or different folks?
I mean, we're generalists. So we've had landscape architects in the office. We've had people whose strengths are interiors. We've had people whose strength is kind of history theory, but they're in fact trained as architects. Mm-hmm. So it really is kind of a broad base. And we range between 35 to 40. Most typically, we were up at 50 in the midst of the work on the embassy in India. But I think what's really nice is it still manages to feel like a real studio and a family, and I think we like that a lot. We're not so interested in becoming a mega scale firm that we can't know everybody's name and say good morning to everybody and feel like we know who's on the team and what they're doing.
I'm wondering, with the type of practice that you guys have, you're both architects, you're an architecture office, but do you think of yourselves as architects, or do you think of yourselves more as just designers of the environment? And I suppose another way to ask the question is, do you, in your mind, do you visualize architecture, landscape architecture, urbanism, et cetera, as being different things, or are those just terms that people use?
Well, it's a super interesting question, because you could argue that for interdisciplinarity to work, there needs to be disciplinarity that has expertise involved. So we do believe in the expertise of each one of these disciplines. But it was our hunch that as the administrative boundaries between these disciplines and the accreditations became increasingly hard-lined, those administrative boundaries were precluding people from thinking ambitiously and intuitively about the fact that our larger problems, where our social and environmental worlds are increasingly impacted and getting diminished, that the answers cannot just be through one lens or another. Right. And so that was where we really determined that we thought that design, architecture, whatever it is we do, has to concern itself with a larger built and unbuilt world together. And yes, we're I would say, approaching it through the lens of architecture, but more expansive in our ambitions for the territory of design, to shape infrastructure, to shape landscape, to shape urban ideas, to shape an opportunity of creating a meaningful public realm. So in a way, the terms become less urgent as we think more broadly at the questions that should be asked.
It's interesting that, having asking broader questions, and that the answer and solution can be powerful if the solution or the design is at the broader scope. So it's bleeding beyond the site. It's more urban. It's dealing with open spaces between buildings. But it's also can be very effective. It is if it's just literally one building, if it's done right and you have the right possibilities there.
Exactly. And, here's an interesting example. We just completed a project for Yale University. It's a SCI Center for Innovative Thinking. And here was a sort of a brief where it was near all these labs, including the wonderful Beckton lab by Marcel Breuer, but in the back behind like 5 different buildings, super complicated site. And the client thought that we were simply going to do an addition to one of the existing buildings there and effectively expand out on that footprint to put this little 12,000 square foot, sort of addition into focus. And so many of our buildings are really tied to really weaving into the landscape. And here was a case where we actually said, no, we think the most important way to answer this was to make one perfect oval of self-supporting curvilinear glass, 22 feet high, that would become this really transparent loft in the middle of all the constellation of the buildings around there. And then we, in effect, invented a courtyard that never existed there and reconnected landscapes and brought trees in and, changed landforms and cut down concrete walls so we could create a setting for this perfect little building. And so, in many ways, we were doing both, but the apparent work was the building. And yet the intrinsically most important work was the creation of that site so that that could be a legible destination.
That project, what was the name of the project again?
It's a Sci Center for Innovative Thinking at Yale.
Right, Sci Center. That project was actually the one I was thinking about, and I don't know how you view it, but when I said that you're creating works that are responsive, but also they stand out and they have their own identity, and it's really interesting that something that on the surface, the building on the surface would seem to be very self-centered. It's a sculptural kind of thing. It's very elegant, whatever, but it's a sculptural thing. It's a standalone object in space that would produce, exterior spaces and community and all the things that you're talking about. And that's what I was saying before. It's like you can have a standalone building and it can do all the stuff if it's done, in the right way. It's very fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, that was a lot of fun. But talk about tuning a building. I mean, there's some crazy things that were going on. Among other things, the ring beam of that oval had to land. It was over a lab building. So we had to actually be able to land on a series of columns that were below grade. So this oval had to just land just so to be able to carry the loads down. We also had to have a skylight on top that went through the center of the building to go all the way down to illuminate a lab that had a named skylight. So we actually had to carry a skylight through 3 floors now. And then there was the notion of the kind of standoff of all the buildings so that we could create enough room and breathing room so that it could get sunlight, so landscape could grow. And it was a cutting down of one of the original Marcel Breuer walls that made that plinth or roof a kind of isolated, distinct place to make it now not a roof, but in fact a destination. Right. So there were many, many things that were changed incredibly subtly, so including slipped-in ADA ramps that would allow it to connect to the other buildings nearby. But we were able to actually take all the mechanical equipment, for instance, for the building and bury it under that plinth so that the building would have less burden on its form and its expression. So, it was really appropriating all the possibilities around it to allow it to be such a simple form.
Yeah, I think that level of intervention and the subtlety, like you mentioned, that's really fantastic. And obviously, when you first see it from an aerial view, I was first reminded of Ian Pei's at the Louvre, right?
The pyramid?
Yeah, the pyramid, like this just crystalline thing. And I've always wondered, it's kind of a side question, like for Ian Pei, when he proposed that, were people like, what the hell is this? You're creating a glass pyramid that has nothing to do with...
Parisians are probably like, what?
But it works so well. I don't know if it's because I've gotten used to it, but I think it works fantastic.
It works incredibly well. Right? It's really an incredible, extraordinary solution to a very complicated problem.
What do you think is the most rewarding part of what you do as an architect?
I think the most rewarding part of it is the moment when it's realized and it's no longer yours and completely used by people in ways you never expected. I mean, that's as good as it gets. I mean, during COVID, the 2 projects, the Hunters Point South Waterfront Park and the Olympic Sculpture Park, both remained open and became these destinations for people to gather, to find each other, to feel safe, to have breathing room, and to see it used and be crowded, but not crowded in a way that was a problem, given the kind of constraints of COVID. That was pretty amazing. And, arguably when people use your buildings in ways that you didn't think about, and they become important in the community and in a sense where people cannot remember that they didn't exist, that's amazing.
Yeah.
So I think for us, it really is maybe the way parents feel when they have kids, where all of a sudden you think, oh, that's my kid, they did that. When they're out in the world and they're adding some agency to communities that might not have had agency before, that they feel woven into connecting, say, parts of a landscape that was disconnected, say on the waterfront. I think all of these things are, aspirations of ours, but when it actually happens, that's incredible.
Yeah, no, I'm sure it is. Did COVID make you question or kind of rethink about the campuses, the educational buildings that you guys work on? Do you start thinking about them a little bit differently now that, we kind of have to like work and think of spaces and collective spaces a little bit more spread out and more distant from each other?
It's a super interesting question, because this pandemic may be in some ways a seminal wake-up call for us to realize that the way we think about space, the way we think about buildings breathing, it's just become foregrounded. A couple of projects that really came into focus in interesting ways for us, the Robert Wilson Overlook and the Brooklyn Botanic Garden. Robert Wilson Overlook is nearly a 600-foot accessible route that connects the very high end of the garden to the lower end, and effectively those who arrived by subway would arrive high and had not had an accessible route. And so that was really about slowing down the experience to amplify the kind of gift of the garden, but also make it accessible. That was one project that, in a sense, took on a different lens through the lens of what a pandemic asks us to do, which is to kind of catch our breath and find some respite from the kind of pressures that are hard to name. And then the other one that was interesting is that the Tata Center for Innovation on Roosevelt Island, part of the Cornell Tech campus, that project with its, studiously generous circulation areas, which you could argue were singularly inefficient, became in some ways viewed as a new lens or a model for the kind of spaces we might want to make in the future, to allow that breathing room to happen, but also to allow collaboration and peripheral vision to be the kind of gift of what coming to a building should offer. We can all learn remotely now. We can all meet remotely. So what is the gift of convening? Why do we need academic buildings? Why do we need cultural buildings? And I think we need them as much for the things that are unplanned as we need them for the planned programmatic elements. So we are inclined to create buildings that by the metrics may be viewed as very inefficient, but by the kind of ambitions of what should be happening socially and culturally, maybe they're the kind of coincidence of how we are predisposed to think about architecture as being supported by the things we need to do now in this kind of post-pandemic moment.
That is a really great point, and I want to kind of repeat that this idea of efficiency or inefficiency, right, is something that I feel like a lot of people, clients, but just generally, people in general, everyone assumes that to be more efficient is automatically better. And in a lot of cases it is, obviously, and maybe 90% of the situations. But there is definitely a thing with space and how people interact where, as you said, it's not just about I need a minimum sized room for X amount of people to be here. I'm going to stack boxes and then I've solved it. I've saved money and et cetera. But you need to create opportunities, spaces for these other meetings and whatever else to happen, in addition to them possibly helping with me wanting to be 10 feet away from everyone for the next 5 years. But the inefficiency is actually very productive.
I think that's exactly right. I think on our Barnard College Diana Center, we have what we call the world's most inefficient fire stair that tracks from one end of the building to another. And it's sort of improbable in many ways that it's a fire stair, but it's relaxed on purpose because the hope is that people are going to be more inclined to take that stair than they are going to be to take the elevator. And in so doing, they're going to bump into people they might not necessarily bump into. I mean, vertical buildings are intrinsically antisocial, and they intrinsically set up, if you will, sort of clubs of consensus identities that emerge floor by floor. And we're very interested, particularly in cultural and institutional buildings, to diminish those differences between floors through visual connections, through easy physical connections. And there is an incredible joy, Piranesi or otherwise, about this kind of the topography of visual connections and physical connections, adding richness to the identity of a building.
Yeah, that's great. That's actually one of the criticisms of the most towers is that, they have a lot of fancy stuff going on the outside, but cut through a section, it's still, 8 foot, 10 foot ceilings, 12 feet if it's like a fancy whatever, but everyone's living on separate planes of existence, at the end of the day.
Well, yeah, and it's not because you have the agenda of efficiency that it needs to be applied to everything on the project. Like you mentioned, the fire stair, the floor plan might be efficient, but let's do something a little bit different where we feel it's necessary.
That's right. Yeah. And, in a sense, you can't do it all the time, but when you can relax the kind of constraints on the public spaces and all the, if you will, connective tissue, you get more out of it. We did a project where there was some existing space that had to be, in a sense, brought in common. And fortunately, the distance between all the buildings that we were trying to connect produced a very, very generous space that we could have do many, many things. And it turns out that space is, which was never in the program, there was never any square footage assigned to it, became not only one of the most generative kind of destinations for that community to convene, but it has become one that other people choose to use and rent space from because it is so compelling. So I think often it's really trying to figure out the questions that have not been asked, to give those room to breathe and to give programmatic agency to some things that might not have been in their particular assessment of what the program needed to accommodate.
Right. Do you find, okay, this question might be stupid since I'm asking you guys this and you do the work you do, but do you find that it's difficult to maintain this kind of open-minded approach to core things like program and basically abandoning preconceptions of what things are when you have a project that doesn't have the greatest budget? It's not, infinite amount of money to do whatever amount of crazy details. Maybe the budget is a little more constrained, maybe the schedule is constrained, and you have a serious client, and there's really serious deadlines. Is it hard to maintain that kind of open approach with all of those factors happening?
It's always a challenge, and sometimes I actually feel like we end up doing almost better work when the deadlines are tighter. I don't want to advertise that too much. But sometimes when you have a gun to your head, you just sort of say, okay, I don't care about any of this, but this is the most important thing. And it just kind of focuses you to say what really is crucial. And then in effect, you can't not solve the problems you've been asked to solve. The real question is, can you transcend that problem solving for it to become something that is broader than problem solving, but creating something that has an identity? Because those are the things that motivate us, are kind of transcending the problem solving, albeit sometimes through problem solving, you can actually, you can address 5 or 6 things simultaneously if you're thinking hard enough, as opposed to just solving them one moment after another. Yeah. And that's really, that's when it gets exciting, is when you can, in a sense, pull these things together and not feel like it's a one of each kind of scattershot assessment and distribution of problem solving, but something that feels richer.
Right. And I feel like this kind of gets back to something you said earlier when we were talking about design process, that there's a moment in the process where there's this kind of a stew of a lot of different things on the table, and we're trying to figure out how these things relate. And, there's, again, an openness to how these things might be assembled or disassembled, or what might be included or excluded, these ideas, these whatever it might be. And there's a kind of, a looseness to it.
Well, did you have a question in there?
No, not really. No question. Just thinking aloud.
Just thinking.
Just reflecting. No, I think that it's such an interesting reflection because, we have yet to have a project where the resources are unlimited. I wonder what that would be like. But at a certain point, resources are limited and time's limited. And figuring out what's essential and endures is important, and one needs to do it not in a state of fear, but in a state of leaning towards something. And often clients have teams where there are layers and layers of people who are there as interpreters, as brokers, as representatives. And because so many projects are structured that way now, often those brokers or representatives, folks, are not given any agency to think fearlessly. They're really there to become stewards of the budget and the schedule. And when their voices are not, in a sense, supported to be able to think in larger terms, that becomes the most difficult moment in a project. And that's why you really want those folks to be side by side and hand in hand with some visionaries, so that they're not on the hook every step of the way with that indexable checklist. But for them to know that that checklist has great value, but occasionally there are some things that transcend the specificity of what's been scripted initially, and the script has to change.
Yeah.
And so that for us is probably, particularly on these larger scale projects, one of the most important things to do is to make sure that the folks who are held responsible are also working closely with the folks who are also dreaming.
Mm-hmm. That's a really great point. And because I think from the designer's perspective, it can be a grueling process to work with someone who is essentially, let's say, is the client you work with, but they don't have the power. And also from that that person's perspective, the client, it sucks to be in that spot because they're like the messenger almost, but they don't have any power, and it becomes very tedious, the whole thing.
Right. No, I have enormous respect for the difficulty of that role.
Yeah.
They're given so much responsibility without necessarily having the full agency to reset the script when it needs to be reset. And so, that's where I'm saying it's so helpful for them to be working very closely, hand in glove with people who can sort of look at the script and say, does it need to be recast?
So, at the beginning of this, we talked about your upbringing and how your interests led to what you're doing today. Is there something that you see, a personal trait of yours that you see as being integral to your success on a daily basis, or even across the lifetime of the firm? Is it a skill set? Is it a mindset?
I would say, probably the most important mindset for any of us is to stay curious and to know that, in a sense, we're beginners at everything we do. And that humility that comes from knowing that you're a beginner at everything you do, whether you're entering a culture you've never worked in before, or you're working with a paradigmatic shift in what a program could be. Knowing that you're a beginner means that you're there to listen to an incredible array of voices. And sometimes you have to learn at the rate of a child on certain projects about what it can be. So I would say maybe the most important mindset is to stay curious and to recognize that you don't want to repeat your successes. You really want to be on to the next adventure.
Is there a hobby or something you do outside of architecture to kind of recharge? Do you run still? Play the piano?
It's funny. I don't run any longer. Let's just say all that running on pavement didn't do the best thing for my knees over time. But do a lot of walking. We walk into work every day across the Brooklyn Bridge from Brooklyn into Tribeca. But the kind of hobbies tend to be what I would call alternate design projects that don't have the kind of the window or the scrutiny of what we do right now within the office. And so it is really involved doing what I would call all kinds of alternate design problems and projects. Drawing, when we were at the American Academy in Rome, it was fantastic to return to drawing, which had been a passion, return to charcoal, return to color, return to drawing landscape. And so that you'd say the kind of parallel passions are drawing and sculpting and model building across an array of things that may not be directly tied to architecture. What was fantastic yesterday was going to MoMA to see a couple of shows and also seeing the Calder show that was up there. And you realize that Calder's work was amazing. And the fun that he was having making, say, the circus for his grandkids was paralleled with some large scale work and then some, kinetic work and then other works that were mounted. And the sense of play that came from that activity of sculpting went from the high level of seriousness to make sure he was staying tight with the canon that would give him legibility, and others that were really going off ramp. That was really inspiring.
Do you find that these other exercises, drawing, sculpting, whatever, they must inform your work somehow, right? Even if indirectly?
They inevitably do. Certainly, model building for me is a way of studying something. And often when we're working on something, I like to make incredibly small models because they distill the thinking. But they also, through the act of making them, whether you're cutting, you're tearing, you're folding, allow you to get to an essential insight about what something can be. And the more complicated the model becomes, usually I realize I'm losing my way. So there is something revelatory, even if it's off-ramp. And often some of the things that we're studying and noodling around with lead to discoveries that we say are the right answer to a different question, and we pocket it away. And sometimes a year and a half later, they come back as being sort of just right for something else.
I mean, that's smart. That's smart to do. I like this idea of you come across an idea and you say, okay, I'm just going to set that aside for the time being. It'll surface when it needs to surface and when it makes sense. When you say small models, you're talking about 6 by 6 inch kind of sphere, right?
Little.
Yeah. Like tiny.
Yeah, like this big. And maybe this big.
Right.
Little.
Baseball size. Yeah. I mean, it seems similar in a way to, and I think this is a pretty common idea that, when you draw and you sketch, like sometimes to understand a building, you have to draw it really tiny. And it forces you to see the part C, to see clarities, to see whatever, right?
That's exactly right. It's a 35,000 foot read of something. If it starts getting super complicated, it better be super complicated for a very good reason.
Right. Yeah, it's difficult. You get lost in the weeds of details and stuff when you draw huge. How thick is this door? Okay, that's not important at this point. I did want to ask you a few questions about the profession of architecture more in general. Is there something about in architecture that excites you today? Either some work done by other architects or a trend or whatever?
I think what's super exciting right now is that we're at a moment where two things are coming into focus as having value that have not been viewed as being so essential for a while. I think the kind of social values of what architecture can and must do and who it must include, and the audiences that are often not included need to be included again. Their voices need to be included in the people we consult with when we design. That's very exciting. I think the other thing that's very exciting is that larger territorial approaches to the land, we're also beginning to understand that they're systemic. They're not bound by property lines. So, for instance, if we're thinking about, say, water detention or retention, we're not thinking about it site by site. We're thinking about it in some cases maybe as far as a regional watershed. So I like the fact that there is an expansiveness and I would say a confidence that we can and should be addressing very broad scale questions that relate to sustainability, that relate to the health of our planet, that recognize the fact that climate change is impacting how we build and what we build with. So I think that there's a return to a seriousness about the very questions that we need to ask, but this time without the discrepancy between design having value and these values having value. There was a moment where sustainable design and social design tended to be weaker in terms of the kind of strength of its identity as, say, architecture or design or landscape architecture. And now I'd say that weakness has gone away, and yet the strength and values that were there have been amplified. So I would say we're probably at one of the most exciting moments that we've ever been in. And we also have a tool chest that's far larger, whether it's our digital tools, our communication tools, AI. We have a whole host of things to bring to the table that we never had before.
And the kind of strengthening of these social and sustainable issues is a result of, it's probably, I mean, I'm sure it's a result of not just the profession moving in a direction, but it's the result of everyone else outside of the profession there's a lot more champions for these two things.
Yes, I think it's a constellation of many, many things, but I also do think that there is a broader collection of facts and outlets for the media, among other things, and even educational venues to be able to convey the fragility, if you will, of our built and social environments. And that means that when we're entering the world of design and we're entering a place where resources are limited, we have to think very strategically about what we're doing and how we're building and who we're building for.
Yeah, I was wondering, and this is sort of related, I think, because you and Michael Weiss, MANFREDI, you had a pretty clear vision or understanding of your interests, and your interests were not limited to, we could say, a more traditional definition of architecture, let's say. But when you guys, and I think that your approach to architecture, your vision for it, has become much more common in a great way. I think there's a lot of newer practices that are thinking the same way that you guys are. But when you first started the office back whatever time, was it weird to operate in this kind of space or to think this way? Because I feel like it's become more common today, in part because of the things you just mentioned.
Right. I mean, I think that we were maybe more in the pioneering end of these sensibilities. And right. I do think that those values of seeing the relationships of these things across all the disciplines has become much more broadly understood as having value. You know, certainly the studios that I teach at Penn, which are research studios, are always considering the larger built environment and drawing landscape and infrastructure, environment, ecology, and art into the equation of the research that we're doing. The teaching that Michael does at Harvard similarly is bringing in the urban realm as a foundational point of departure. So I would say we're actually really encouraged that there's more momentum for seeing these values, because it does mean now that there are problems and questions being asked that are broader because of this.
Right. What do you think the biggest challenge that the profession of architecture faces today, or what is the one thing that's holding it back?
Well, you know, we have a lot of challenges, and I would say probably one of the biggest challenges I see is that there is an increasing desire to consolidate risk by institutions who are now leaning towards project delivery typologies that are biased towards building first and thinking about design second, because it minimizes risk. And the desire, say, to put the designer under contract, say, to the contractor, is something that many institutions are looking at as a way to mitigate their risk and consolidate their obligations of communication. I do think that there can be some fantastic outcomes from this if you've got the right client and the right contractor, but the diminishment of the appreciation of the benefit that design offers, I think, is a little bit of a risk as people become fearful about their resources. So that's one. I think the other is that the enormous ventilation of media that are showing, you know, one extraordinary vision after another has created almost a numbing of, if you will, what's excellent and what's interesting, because there's so much of it around us. And so I think that sometimes the focus on concentration that we all need to bring to our work, so that we don't repeat the things that are in our peripheral view, that the level of distraction is greater than ever. So I would say those are, you know, from distraction with one turn of the dial, it can also be incredible stimulation. And then from kind of consolidated or minimized risk agendas, there could be maybe new solutions that have yet to be considered that can, in a sense, keep aspirations high while mitigating risk. So those are two very, very different answers to the same question. And yet, I think those are a couple of things that are at stake. I think a third thing that's at stake is that we all have to think about our environment. And, you know, architecture and building take up an awful lot of our carbon footprint. Yeah. And so I do think that we really have to think about our lease of what's there, how and what we build, and the disposability of so much of the architecture that has only a 25-year aspiration, as opposed to the 50 and 100-year that you could say we really need to be thinking about. These are all, I think, sort of in the kind of climate of where we are right now, we need to really address seriously.
No, absolutely. We have a question for the first one or the second one?
The first one.
Okay, let me talk about the second one real quick.
Oh, okay.
So the second point, though, so the concern. So the second point was, you know, the proliferation of fancy architecture, or whatever you call it, you know, through the media. The concern is that designers become overly influenced by these things, in essence, and there's a bit of copying or being over-influenced by them.
I think it's less copying and being over-influenced by it. I think it's the sense that everything needs to be a particular kind of handstand, if you will.
Oh, right.
And and there are signatures that each era has of what that handstand looks like.
Mm-hmm.
And if you say, look back 10 years ago, you could say it was a parametric signature.
Right.
You could argue that it's a different one right now.
The parametric signature did not last long. Those guys thought it was going to be around. It was like the next 500 years, it's the future of civilization, fizzled out within 10 years.
Technology evolved too fast.
A little bit of a parametric storm. And yet, what it did, though, is it offered a kind of agency to many, many other ways of working.
Yeah.
And so when it became integrated and more normative, it offered up some fantastic things. So, I think it's really just, at least as I find in teaching, there is a tendency to, borrow without insight, as opposed to, say, learning from a case study where there's great insight through the study of something. And a design studio that I've been teaching for a while really draws on, interrogating these hybrid case studies, such as, say, the Kaju Bridge in Isfahan that nobody looks at, and yet we think has triple agency. And by analyzing it, you can draw from something as opposed to simply copying the image of something.
Yep.
I think
Agreed.
that's my biggest critique of the media around architecture is that it doesn't really dive into the architecture and the message and the process and what it's trying to accomplish, and it's really just this kind of superficial publicity of architecture.
You need clicks. The media, they need that's the problem, is that their the structure is based on how many clicks they get.
Yeah.
But you had a question about
my question was about your first point. So you're basically saying that, as we know it, working on residential projects, that sometimes clients want to just hire a contractor and kind of bypass using a designer or an architect, that this is something that you've noticed is happening now on the types of projects that you guys work on a certain level?
Large institutions are experimenting right now. I think the jury's still out for them and for the process, but they're experimenting right now with delivery processes of buildings that are suggesting that maybe there's one entity that's hired, and that one entity, the contract goes through the contractor, and the contractor hires the architect and all the other disciplines and engineers, so that it's one, in a sense, umbrella of, if you will, decision making and cost modeling. The challenging thing there, though, which never really gets stated very clearly, is that contractors have an enormous amount of financial risk, and they need to really mitigate that risk at all times. Yeah. And they don't necessarily have the kind of, in a sense, intrinsic aspirations that, say, an owner and a designer might also be able to give value to and still be responsible financially. So there's a weighting towards diminishing risk as opposed to a weighting towards amplifying what the dream might be and delivering it responsibly. And so by creating a buffer of that relationship between the owner and the architect through the lens of the contractor becomes, in a sense, a diminishment of being able to truly have that rich dialogue to create the dream first and then figure out how that dream can be achieved in an economically smart way. The thing that I'm struck by is that you can spend an awful lot of money and do some terrible building. And
there are a lot of bad buildings out there.
And you could spend 30% less.
Yeah.
And with good design, do something that's 200% better. And yet I think there's a lot of, if you will, inexperience to understand the value of what that might be. And that's something that maybe our field needs to do a lot better work at conveying that value. And that value is not just tied to the style or the expression of something, but its true value in terms of the insight that designers can bring to the, in a sense, the addressing of the questions, the addressing of the complexity, and reducing the complexity at some times, and answering fewer questions to be able to do something better.
That's another really great point, because for contractors, but also for clients, the concern is, of course, the budget. Like, we have a maximum budget, and why am I going to waste money on an architect? But you answered it perfectly. It's like, it's not just about how much money you sink into construction to build the thing or whatever. It's about how smart you are with the design. So even if you spend less of construction, if you allocate a portion of that money to hiring a designer, as someone who's good, it's going to be better. That's great.
Oh,
it's simple.
Always.
Yeah.
Well, if it's a good designer.
If it's a good designer, sure, of course.
but always. And, I kind of liken it to the fact that many people believe that they kind of understand what design is and they feel like they can do it, much the way somebody who's putting together, say, a PowerPoint for a meeting might think that they have all the insight of a graphic designer.
Yeah.
But their trainings are different. And so what they can bring to the table is different. And it may not have as much insight as it might have if it were carried through the lens of somebody whose expertise is in that field. We tend not to question what a doctor or surgeon is doing because we know that their expertise is essential for our health. But we always question what a designer does because in our hearts, we think that we're all the designers.
Right.
So at least that's my sense of where some of the, if you will, slippery slope is.
Yeah. No, I agree with that. And I think it's the notion that a lot of architects and designers agree with as well. And it's probably, if I want to add a fourth challenge to the list, that would be the next one, or one of them is this communication of that value when it tends to be elusive or there's an assumption. I think that you're probably right, like 98% of the people out there, 90% of the people assume like, well, I get it. Like I get at least good enough to where I could do it or I don't need you. But the arrangement of client, contractor, and then architect, right? I mean, I was actually in a meeting with a contractor and they were doing a presentation and they were pitching this as the better way to do things, obviously. I mean, he's a contractor. And I don't know if that's considered design build or is it build design? I'm not sure what it is at that point.
It's called delegated design. You might say that you have an idea for how, say, a curtain wall should go in or how a wall ought to be constructed. But if it's delegated design, they, in a sense, have responsibility for doing it a certain way because they are effectively engineering it. And that's the kind of delegated design model that people often do, say, for curtain wall. And does it begin to approach design build? A little bit, but it tends to be in parts. So that's very different than design build, which is more comprehensive.
Mm-hmm.
Right. I know we're short on time, but on that, have you guys ever participated in like a design build contract where you're, to be honest, actually the technical definition of what defines design build versus delegate design and whatnot is a little bit elusive to me, but where it's like one contract, but you're working with the contractor?
We haven't done that before. There have been clients who've discussed that with us about wondering whether that might have value. And as we've assessed it with them, we've determined that other models might have value that aren't maybe the most obvious design build model. So it has been, something that clients are looking at very carefully in some cases, and others they're not. We have not done it yet.
The whole dynamic between those three parties is interesting, but also very important to understand. And it's funny how when it shifts just in one direction a little bit, it changes the whole process and therefore the outcome.
Yes, I think that's correct.
Well, we are right at 11 o'clock in Pacific time. This has been fantastic. Thank you so much for coming on the show. This was great.
Yeah, it was great talking with both of you. And, I look forward to continuing our conversation.
Cool. Thanks for listening to this week's episode. If you like what we're doing, then please support us by leaving a review in the Apple Podcast app. Elsewise, you can send us a review, and that helps us as well. And then we can...
we'll get it tattooed on our bodies.
Get it tattooed. You can also find us on YouTube and Spotify. If you like what we're doing, then subscribe to the show on those places as well. Leave a comment. Let us know how it's going. And we're on the social medias.
Well, on pretty much all the biggest social media platforms, such as Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. We also have a hotline where you can text or call and leave a voicemail if you have any questions, any guest suggestion, any story you want to share, any feedbacks you want to give. The number is 213-222-6950.
This is episode 225. That's crazy. We're getting up there. Up there.
Okay.
You know what I mean?
Is there a number we're trying to reach?
Yeah.
Or we're just going for shooting for the infinite?
1 billion. But for the listeners who have left reviews and reach out to us, thanks. It means a lot and we appreciate it. And stay tuned for more good stuff.
Yeah, right? Keep listening.
All right. Talk to you soon. Bye.
Bye-bye.